Good morning. This is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to our bonus Bible study here on Thursday, November the 5th, where we continue our series on the Bible Project. As always, we have two goals that we like to lift up during this project. And the first is we just want to read the Bible better. So we're going into various angles, various dimensions of the Bible to improve our own reading. And secondly, we want everyone to get used to using this online tool called the Bible Project for your own study. There's just so many resources there, and I've been happy to hear back from many of you that you're starting to dig down deep into some of those resources. I'm just thrilled about that. Before we begin our session today, let's again do the recap, and I do this over and over again to make sure we understand the path that we've been on and how much territory we've covered. First of all, the Bible is a library of books, 6 books for Protestants. We have them as a unified story, a unified library pointing to Jesus and the gospel. It is also Jewish meditative literature, which means it's overlapping symbols. One story helps us interpret the other, and that's important. Also that we have 3 genres of literature. First, we talked about the narrative, the story dimensions, and we've covered some examples of that in the Bible. The second is poetry, which is 1/3 of the Bible. And last week, we covered some examples of poetry in the Bible. And this week, we're going to take a look at the Bible as discourse. And we'll give some examples too. 2 in particular, one from the Old Testament. We'll take a look at the laws, probably the least favorite section. I think of the Old Testament, that's the place often we get lost, right? We stop reading the Bible, but they're important. And then we're going to take a look at one of Paul's letters in the New Testament as an example, again, of this type of genre of discourse literature in the Bible. So we want to start our section on discourse, these examples in the Old Testament, with the laws. And you can read through these, and sometimes they're so arcane and ancient that your eyes start to glaze over, and yet they're so important, because with the laws, this discourse of literature, God is talking about God's contract with Israel. Now, that's a kind of a complex idea, the idea of covenant, but basically God's giving the laws as part of this relationship then with Israel. Now, do you know how many laws are in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in what we call the Torah? 613 laws. Imagine if you had to memorize all of them. But that is part of this moral, legal, theological, spiritual contract that God then has with Israel. And ultimately, what the law does is shows where Israel has come up short in the relationship. And in our own theological heritage, we say there are 2 uses of the law. The first is the civil use, which creates a trustworthy world. We know how things work between people. But the ultimate goal, we say, is the second use of the law, the theological use, which exposes us as sinners. In other words, we can't meet God's criteria for the law of love, and so ultimately, laws don't create a trustworthy world. They show us where we come up short. But there are other dimensions to the law that will be pointed out in this section. It talks about sacrifices. There are 5 different types of sacrifices which were part of the law. Issues of personal as well as societal justice, like using the 10 Commandments. There's the idea of sacred time that we'll hear about. That is marked by the week. First of all, 6 days God worked. On the 7th day, God rested. And then we are invited into this Sabbath rest, this eternal relationship with God. All this is to say there are many dimensions of the law, and we want to approach it as discursive literature to see how we are to read these sections now of the Old Testament. And so, discursive literature in the Old Testament, let's take now a look at God's law.
If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the second book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now, these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse, and they're found all over the second, third, fourth, and fifth books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something you and your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So, let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so, while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them, because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
Right. And so it leads to another round of tragedy, violence, and death.
And it ends in exile.
And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of two different fabrics. Like how does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing of animals?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person and treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day. In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus liberation by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now, what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the seventh day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sevens?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the 7th day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the ideal of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future hope.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom. And the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. And that brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right. He was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws. And he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
That was a wonderful section that we just saw on one dimension of discursive literature, God's law in the Old Testament. Now we want to go over to the New Testament to see the example of discursive literature. And here we take a look at letters, in particular the letters of Paul, but there are other letters as well, 21 letters in the New Testament, 13 of which are written by Paul, although that's a debated claim. The scholars will go back and forth with certain books, whether it was Paul or one of his students writing in his style using his own theological vocabulary. We're not going to discuss that today. Our interest is just in the character of these letters, how they were put together, much like some of the rules we have today when we write a letter. You start off with greetings, you have addresses, you might say something to begin as a salutation, as a greeting, then you go to the body of the letter, and then you close it in a certain way. I mean, we all understand that because we've written so many letters. Well, at least we used to write letters before email. And even email has a different set of rules, doesn't it? So that's what we're going to learn here. And as an example, he will point, our guides use Ephesians as an example. And they'll talk about Ephesians, what happens in the first part of the book, chapters 1 through 3, and then how it connects to the second part of the letter, where it goes 4 to 6. And again, they're pointing to the nature of letter writing and how complex it was. I think it's one of the great dimensions that we often forget is that most people didn't read in the ancient world. And so when these letters were brought into a small house church, someone would get up and read it for them. So most people heard the letters being read, a lot like in the early Americas, right? In the 18th century, you had the heralds who would go into bars and read the newspaper. Well, that's what we have here. And it's interesting that these letters then took a lot of time, cost a lot of money, and they were often, in essence, performed before a group. They were heard. In any case, let's now turn to the New Testament as it focuses in on discursive literature. Enjoy.
Near the end of the Bible are 21 letters written to communities of Jesus' followers throughout the ancient Roman Empire.
Letters? Like I'm reading someone's mail.
Yeah, the letters are written by the apostles, that is, the people that Jesus appointed to spread the good news about his kingdom. And they wrote to Jesus' followers living in different cities around the Roman world. These letters were all written in a style called prose discourse.
Now, if I'm reading a letter that wasn't written to me, then there's likely a lot of background information that's assumed but not mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And the letters in the Bible are no different.
Okay, so let's talk about how to read the New Testament letters in historical context.
So there are three levels of historical context to keep in mind when reading the New Testament letters. The first is how all the letters fit into the larger storyline of the scriptures.
Right. So, this story begins with God creating humanity as his partners to rule creation with him. But we choose to rule on our own terms, leading to violence, exile, and death.
But God promises a guy named Abraham that life and blessing will spread to all nations through him and his descendants to renew God's vision for humanity.
And Jesus said he came to bring that promise to its fulfillment through his life, death, and resurrection.
Right, and so the apostles saw themselves as heralds, announcing the arrival of God's kingdom in Jesus. Like the apostle Paul. When he wrote to the house churches in Rome about the good news, he said his job was to summon people of all nations to give their allegiance to Jesus, the exalted King of the world.
That's a bold thing to say to people living in the capital city of the Roman Empire, whose allegiance is supposed to be to Caesar.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to the second important context for understanding the New Testament letters, the culture of the Roman Empire in the first century.
So Rome ruled all of these territories around the Mediterranean Sea.
And they built their empire by conquering and enslaving their enemies and then imposing heavy taxes. The emperor and his small circle controlled all of the power and wealth, and they knew how to deal with people who threatened the social order.
Most people lived without much money or stability.
And Roman culture had a very clear hierarchy. Men from important families with money and education could move ahead in society. But women, slaves, children, and the poor were always at a disadvantage and treated as inferior.
Yet, in a community of people who followed Jesus, everyone was treated with love and equal dignity.
Yeah, in Roman life, it was unheard of for people of high status to associate with people below them. But the apostles said that through Jesus, God had given the gift of his love to everyone without regard to their status.
So, in that context, these letters were countercultural, and they broke down barriers between people.
Exactly. And so that brings us to the last level of context, the situational context of each letter.
You mean the specific issues in the church of a city that prompted the writing of the letter in the first place?
Yeah, like Paul's letter to the Christians in Rome. It's tempting to read this letter and focus on all the important theology and then overlook why he wrote this letter.
Why did he write it?
Well, towards the end, he talks about how Jewish food laws and sacred days have become controversial between Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus.
Which was creating divisions in the church.
And if you read carefully, you can see that some Christians with higher social status were treating Jewish followers of Jesus with contempt.
And Jewish Christians were returning the favor, condemning the non-Jews as second-rate followers of Jesus.
Exactly. And so all of the ideas and theology in the first part of the letter were crafted to address those very problems. Paul acknowledges that the Roman Christians have big differences in culture, theology, and social status, but he wants them to realize that they are unified by their faith in Jesus, who is the real center of their church.
Okay, great. But if that letter was written to someone else, then what should I get out of it? I mean, I don't live in ancient Rome.
Well, in these letters, we see the apostles challenging and transforming every part of their first century culture and life with the good news about King Jesus. And by watching them, we gain wisdom about how that same good news can transform our culture as well. Now, there's one more helpful step to take in reading the New Testament letters, and that's learning how to follow the flow of thought from the letter's beginning all the way to its end. And that's what we'll look at next.